CNN projects that Donald Trump
will become the 47th President of the United States.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to this episode of Hear My Cry, a show where we discuss issues relevant to the society, where we listen to the voice of the people we might disagree with. So in the last episode of Hear My Cry, we did talk about the issue of the USAID and the impact that it has on the African continent, the cut that President Trump did. And we know that he did cut the USAID, the head of it, but there is a portion that was not touched that is relative to
PEPFAR,
the
HIV
PEPFAR
AIDS.
and the HIV/AIDS support in Africa. So that was untouched. So now we want to talk about issues that are the core of the whole USAID. For example, corruption at the USAID. For example, last week there was a news from Fox where organizations in the US were involved in corruption and companies were involved in corruption. So although the USAID has some good in itself, but we can see that it's also crippled with corruption. So today with us in the studio, we have two opposing views. One is a liberal and the other is a conservative. And we want to discuss why is the USAID good or why was the cut valid? Welcome, Rob.
Nice to see you, Minko.
Welcome back to the
Nice to see
studio.
you, Dave.
Welcome, Dave, joining us
Yeah, and nice to
all
see
the way from
both of you.
Seattle. Yes.
Yes,
How is it that side?
nice to see both of you. Yes, and you know it's an honor to be here. And Rob, we miss seeing you in Seattle, and Menko, we hope to see you here soon.
So my
Yes.
question to you is, do you think the US has Africa best interests when the motto or the mission of the USAID is to advance US foreign policies and economic prosperity abroad? So that is, when you look, maybe that's not the entire statement, but I just want to take that particular line. If you can give an answer to that.
I think I can, Dr. Menko. When I look at this, what I think I see is that national interest may not always align with the local interests that may be on the ground in various countries, let's say in Africa, but this could really be expanded around the globe. So we have a balancing act going here. We have crafting of national interests and prioritizing using American power to defend national interests. And that may be something that doesn't feel very good to the recipients on the ground who may be looking at it from the standpoint of their communities, right?
Okay.
And so they may very quickly feel as if this is heavy-handed, or if we are pushing our views onto their community. Now, it's an interesting thing. If we don't push our views, in a sense, if you think it, I think it's been said that nature abhors a vacuum, right? Nature does not like a vacuum, and that applies both to the physical world and to the world of social interactions. If we aren't pushing this, who is pushing an agenda? Is that agenda being pushed by Russia? Is that agenda being pushed by China? And one of my concerns that I would say to you, Dr. Menko, and to Rob is, what is filling the void, not just in Africa, but maybe in South America, in Afghanistan, other areas of the globe where USAID has been active in addition to Africa. Now that it's no longer there and it's gone, right? Have we opened up a vacuum that's going to be filled by adversarial relationships? And so I don't think it's wrong for us to try to push our national interests forward, but it has to be balanced with the views of the community. It has to be sensitive and listening to what people want. And I'm sure there's a way to craft that represents our views and doesn't result in us yanking it out from underneath each community.
Okay. So, to Rob, there was a summit where African leaders joined President Trump at the White House, and there was a statement from the Gabonese president. So, when he addressed the president, there was a statement from the Liberian president as well. But I just want to take the statement from the Gabonese president, where he said, we want to build our own industries. We want you to help us to train our people so that we can process our own stuff, we can do our own export. So you can see that he was not of the view he was not in favor of being handed the checks. So he wanted the US to assist in developing, in building the skills so that they can grow their own industries. So I believe that is the perspective that you have to say, we don't want the checks. We want, we want to learn how to fish so that we can fish ourselves.
What I appreciated about the time we talked last time, Dave, was that we both want to see what you're suggesting, including the positive influence that the United States can offer the entire world and Africa. We have an amazing model of how to run a country. It stuns me. I'm an African. One of the things that amazed me when I came to the United States was to begin to understand how 4.3% of the world's population creates 25% of the world's GDP. And that was pre-World War II. After World War II, you saw the rise of Japan, you saw the rise of the Far East, you saw the rise of South Korea, the rise of Germany, all this wealth created, the rise of China, all the wealth that China creates, and with all that additional wealth, 4.3% of the world's population right now, the United States, still creates 25% of the world's GDP. We're doing something right. And to the extent that we can influence other countries around the world to learn from us and to copy us would seem to be a very kind thing to do. And I think we're both on the same page. We want to have influence with our foreign aid, however that looks. It no longer looks like USAID, and for some very, very clear reasons. But we all want to see us giving aid where it is needed, particularly in a crisis. And then also if a country reaches out like the Gabonese president, who's saying, we no longer want aid, we don't want a check, what we want is economic development, that's a very different discussion to what we have historically done through USAID. And I think sometimes USAID has been more effective under a certain ideological perspective from the United States than other times. And I think the discovery by Doge in the early weeks of looking at USAID horrified those of us that were conservative. Perhaps there was even an overreaction, but there was a reaction. I heard of a lady recently whose husband got dragged in his bachelor's party to a strip club he would never have gone to on his own, but it cost him his marriage. You see, the gal would not walk down the aisle because she was so horrified that he even agreed to this coercion that happened. And I think in some ways, us conservatives looked at what USAID is funding around the world and said, hell no, this has to stop. Let's find another way to achieve those goals that both the liberal and the conservative want to achieve, you see? And so I think part of it is just undoing some very bad influence that USAID was funding because we had an ideology from the far left that put secondary drives primary, you see. And I'll give you an example, supporting programs to build an inclusive and capable workforce with a special emphasis on climate change in Egypt. USAID spent $43 million to accomplish that goal, you see. And that's a goal that is supported by the far left, but not supported by the right. And so a lot of what we saw happening was not what the Gabon president is asking for, and it wasn't furthering the core goals that has made America great from a conservative perspective. Maybe the left think that inclusion and and climate change is what has made America great. But we then have an ideological difference. But certainly, I think it got to a point where there was enough wrong in what USAID is funding for us to find an alternative way of achieving the goals that USAID originally was set up to achieve.
Yeah. So to substantiate maybe what Rob has said from the African perspective, just to put the numbers, throw the numbers there for those that might be watching this and maybe might be crying as why the USAID, a particular section of the USAID has been cut. So this is, for example, in Zambia in 2021, 2023, the US found nearly half of 2,000 pharmacies were selling medication that were funded by the USAID. And in Kenya, the USAID suspended funding to the Ministry of Health, and opened an investigation because of corruption. In Liberia, there was misappropriation of funds until the embassy in Liberia opened an investigation. And in Kenya and Central African Republic, an orphan charity that was involved in sex abuse and only was defunded after whistleblowers came out. So this is just an example of, yeah. So you can go ahead.
Yes, I want to answer that question, and it's a great question. I think that first, I would say, I think we can always find examples where there has been the misuse of funds. We would expect that. I mean, it's a problem when you have massive programs. There will be corrupt agents who take advantage of such things. But we have to ask, are those the exceptions or the rules? And going back to Rob for a moment here, I think you're right, Rob. America, with 4.3% of the world's population, was a stellar performer in terms of productivity. Remember, that happened in a mixture of both conservative and liberal governments. And maybe our strength is the fact that we aren't polarized. We're able to sort of guide ourselves to the best solution by bringing all the minds together at the table. So, for example, when we look at the corruption that you're speaking about, very terrible, never should be allowed to happen. And if I were to look at that, I would see that that might be a system that had become so large that we weren't defining the goals of activities that receive the aid in a way that was clearly set to measure and to be able to look at the outcome. Yes. So we didn't have a good reporting mechanism back. Now, in my mind, I think those examples are worth investigating. They should be investigated. Things should be changed about those programs, and those programs struck as NGOs or nonprofits, whatever you'd like to call it. But at the other end of the extreme, are we tilting the world towards more corruption, perhaps, by withdrawing aid in certain areas where corruption then does come in because people are desperate? They're trying to solve their problems, maybe using methods that once were provided by aid, but now it's provided through the routes of corruption and other types of authoritarian or negative behaviors. So I worry about regional stability when we withdraw the aid, that might in turn promote more corruption. Well, yes, it's not attached directly to our dollars. That's maybe a beneficial side to it, but the other side is from a regional stability standpoint. Have we created more problems of the type that we wish the aid would have solved? So I'm skeptical of what we might call missionary work. In other words, going in and just saying, here's the dollars you need to go do something, go do good works, right? I am not skeptical of using it as a tool of foreign policy and strategically maximizing the values that are consistent between our government and the governments that have received the aid. What I am against is withdrawing all aid in all conditions, or at least I'm maybe against is too strong a word. I'm concerned about it because I see why we did it. I'm not opposed in any way. I see myself sort of as a centrist in this. I'm not opposed to refining these thoughts, but I am opposed to losing some of the grasp we had on policy, stability, and anti-corruption in some of these communities.
Rob first, then Dave. How can we make the USAID more effective?
Well, that's a good question. Clearly, what I think Dave and I both agree on, and that is in genuine crisis, not only are we obligated morally as a nation to help, but we do help. The entire nation will support that kind of help. And so cutting legitimate aid to legitimate crisis, if the liberals or the conservatives did that, there would be an outcry from the American people. You see, and I think one of the reasons we don't have an outcry across political lines at the moment is because we are continuing to fund HIV, anti-malaria, and where there is other legitimate crisis, we will rise up to respond to it. The question is the traditional USAID model, with all its bloated bureaucracies, 20,000 of them, all receiving salaries, all solving crises, are there 20,000 crises around the world that require USA to intervene? You see, it's hard to even analyze that many. And so what the Trump administration has done is said, where there's real crisis, we're going to keep funding, and the rest of them, we can look at them, they will emerge. Crisis will emerge, and then through the State Department, which is directly tied to foreign policy, tied to the administration that the American people have voted in, we then respond. And I think there's a closer tie then between American interests and responding to a crisis that is aligned with the general will of the people. Coming back to the economic stability that is called on by the Gabonese and by others, I think that both the State Department and the Defense Department, where it's in our interest from a defense perspective, from our overall economic health side, is that there are going to be ways to encourage American investment in these countries, which I think would do an immense amount of good, and that's going to require some cooperation. Here, Trump is saying, you guys have got rules in South Africa, and you've got tariffs in South Africa that make it very difficult to do. So let's level the playing field. Let's negotiate that out to what is best. And I think, the Gabonese president sitting down with whoever Trump appoints to be the liaison between the Gabonese and the Americans can come and negotiate what is best for that country's economic health. You see, but if they had an earthquake all of a sudden, you bet your bottom dollar we will respond as a conservative government. A liberal government would do the same thing. It doesn't have to be done through USAID and endless money.
So you basically want it to be like the FEMA works in the US.
Very similar to that, yes.
FEMA is only works or activated when there is a crisis in the US.
Right, and interestingly enough, FEMA doesn't act independent of the state that has the crisis. That's a negotiated response. The FEMA puts everything available to the governor of that state, and they cooperatively then negotiate how to respond to a crisis. You see, and I think if there was that attitude in a crisis in a country, there's two perspectives. Africa would like to see economic development. We want to see people getting jobs. We want to see crisis ended through economic life, which is the most healthy way to do it. But if there is a temporary crisis where people are dying, that can be negotiated with Zambia or Gabon or Sudan right now, or the Ethiopian crisis where there's war. And in some ways, it's a much more healthy way to do it, because the United States could come into an oppressive government and say, we will help, but here's the conditions. Stop doing this, stop doing that. Yeah. That's the tension we have right now in Gaza. How do we help when the Hamas has taken advantage of the help and using that for political purposes? It becomes very difficult to know how to help, and the whole world wants to help, you see? And so I think there's a way to do it without this sort of over-fossilized USAID system that was where so much of the money was just paying for all the players involved, and very little money actually trickled to the people needing the help, you see? And then you needed people needing the help perpetually in order to keep the superstructure funded, you see? And so it became, to us, somewhat an incestuous pool of money where there's corruption, there was just long-term employment jobs, and then the crisis at the end. For example, if you're going to have a ministry or an NGO supporting an orphan crisis, in order to keep that NGO going, you need the orphan crisis. You see?
Yeah.
At what point do you solve the crisis and say it's done? Very difficult to do that in the USA superstructure.
Okay, Rob, some very fine points. I think, Rob, first of all, I'm not in any way opposed to conditionality of aid. I think we have a moral obligation on one hand to support countries. On the other hand, I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to ask, is it a stable political environment that's aligned with the values of our nation? And I think I hear you saying that. I don't think that that's in any way a problem. I would say, I think we here in the United States just recently had just an incredible tragedy happen in Texas. You're aware of these terrible floods.
Yeah.
There's a situation I'd like to see us avoid, not only in Texas or anywhere in the United States, but anywhere in the world. They knew that river had the potential to flood, and unfortunately, the prevention mechanism wasn't in place. Instead, we had the emergency response after the flood. And I think any one of us in America and probably globally would say it would have been great if we had spent those dollars up front to have a better way of notifying people. So as much as that's a horrible, painful example, what I'd like to say is when we can see there's going to be a problem, I think we need to emphasize national security. I think there is a moral dimension to our foreign policy also that includes humanitarian work and looking at things that we can prevent. Obviously, Rob, when you have 20,000 different agencies and projects around the globe, it's reasonable, and I support Trump's perspective. We need to look at each one of those and ask, what is this accomplishing? I think, on the other hand, we need to also empower, and I'm reluctant to use the word empower because it's so much part of the left vocabulary, but I think it's reasonable to ask, are there leaders within those communities who could become points of influence whom we could work with to deliver aid in a way that works both for our national interests, our bank accounts, our values, and the needs of the community, and get rid of those other things that are simply wasting money, resources, and time. That to me is a reasonable proposition.
I think that if we can learn the habit of hearing the other side, we would be a far better country, and we would be able to have the country digest changes from either government, either party that's in government, if we are understanding the heart motivation behind it rather than just being opposed to it carte blanche. And I was reading some of the headlines when it was first announced that USAID would be ended, and I could not find a typical liberal media source supporting any aspect of shutting down USAID. It was just people will die, calamity, end of the world. This is terrible, terrible, terrible. Life will never be the same. There was no attempt to say, there's some reasons to stop this, and I can support the Trump administration at least 5% or 2% or 1%. It was just, this is the worst thing ever that's ever happened. And it has now happened, and we're not seeing crises and calamities and countries falling and people dying the way that it was predicted, you see. And I think on my side, the same thing. I think we need to go across and say, we're hearing those cries. Are they valid cries? And I feel like I did that to a small extent because when it was announced, literally, Dave, you were taking me, maybe Will was taking me, I don't remember, but somebody was taking me to the airport, and I got a call saying, can you call your friends, whoever you have influence in the State Department, and say, please do not cut off PEPFAR, and please do not cut off PMI. We had folk going to the NGO in Uganda to get the spray to do our indoor residual spraying of malaria, and they called and said, don't come. And that meant more people would die of malaria. And I got on the phone, and I did what I could. And I don't know that I had any impact whatsoever, but I do know that within 24 hours, those two programs were being protected, you see. And it was because I heard folk on the other side calling me out and crying, saying, this can't stop, you see. And so I listened as a conservative and then reached out saying, I support the USAID being head cut off because I've seen the damage it's done, particularly in Sudan where I'm involved, but I don't support it being carte blanche on everything. We've got to find those programs like PEPFAR, like PMI, that is saving lives. At the same time, should only the United States be funding PEPFAR? Why not fund PEPFAR in a broader coalition and then also find alternatives to, which is happening, HIV/AIDS medication that makes it easier for it to be afforded at a local level or local country level. And so I think that if our political voices could listen to the other side, we would find us coming across far more tempered, and we'd be able to cross the aisle and show support where support is needed.
So Dave, do you agree with that point that, which is a valid point, that let other countries also come on the table? The USAID and PEPFAR also has to be a joint contribution with other countries.
I do. And actually, I recall that call, Rob. We talked about the President's Malaria Initiative, and I think both of us were uplifted by the fact that that was something that was spared, these cuts, because there's an example of a program that works extremely well in my mind, and one that has saved countless lives. I mean, literally millions of lives. And, you know, it will surprise you, Rob. I look at the current state of foreign policy in the nation, and there are many, many things I can point to and see huge progress. And I think that's a compliment from a liberal guy looking at the Trump administration and saying some of the moves have been just absolutely well executed and brilliant moves from my perspective. So it's not that I agree with you. We need to be able to talk to each other and look for the commonalities, the similarities, not the differences. And that's something we try to do in this show. So I want to acknowledge I see some very good things. And I think the idea of just giving money away under the idea of a vague idea of development is not, or as sort of a general humanitarian gesture, is actually a disservice. I think we do need to think about objective outcomes. How do we measure those outcomes? How do we quantify those? And how do we give feedback to the decision makers who are asking, is this part of national security? Is this strategic? Is this supporting the right things in that country that local leaders see? At the same time, I think we have to be careful that we don't just draw the carpet away, leave people without anything, because again, I'm going to go back to the point that nature rejects a vacuum. It will be filled by people, some of whom will be bad actors. Now, if we go to national interests of other countries who may align or may not align, there's a lot of work in aligning our foreign policy, even with the European Union in many cases. Witness what's been happening as we sort of try to dice our positions for Israel. You may have objections out of other countries that don't see it that way and may not be willing to join forces with us in an aid perspective, and they may use it to craft their national agenda. So I think, well, it's a great idea, a great goal. If we could separate out that particular piece, it would sure lessen the burden on our nation. But on the other hand, I strongly believe that this is not a handout. This is a development of strategic importance for the nation. It's a way that America can influence not the adults in that community today, but the children in that community today who are growing up, who may be facing a life of misguided difficulties or facing some of the gifts that America can bring to the table. So I'd like to think that that's what we see when we give aid, if we do it properly.
You raise an interesting point, and it's just made me consider, I don't know if you'd call it a vacuum, but if aid becomes so flowing into an environment that may not be a good environment, a country that is dealing with corruption, is dealing with oppression, as we see in Sudan, the fact that local money, that local resources of a country that would put some of its resources into that crisis that no longer has to do that, then that creates the opposite effect. It creates the opportunity for them to use that money then for more nefarious ends, perhaps, or for other ends. And so you don't build that self-dependency on a country. For example, had PEPFAR not been funded, what would the South African, the Zambian, the Ugandan, the Kenyan countries do who heavily need HIV/AIDS medicine for that large percentage of the population that will die if they don't get it? You see, they'll become more responsible. They'll reach out. Perhaps they'll reach out to more of the world. Perhaps they'll raise local taxation to pay for that or change something. But they haven't needed to do that because that vacuum was filled by USAID and not filled by the local government. You see, and I remember being at that discussion because before PEPFAR, we had some kids in our orphanage that needed HIV drugs and we could not afford it. And we turned to our own government and the government could not afford it at that time. They needed intervention and it was a crisis that was valid, you see. But now, literally 20 years later, nothing has changed locally. It's still dependent on PEPFAR. And so perhaps you have the opposite effect. You fill the vacuum and it allows then for a local solution not to be found, both monetarily wise, but even the will to do it. And so I think that it's a very valid point that if the USAID is, or the pulling out of USAID in a country creates a vacuum, I think we do need to look at that very carefully. And the State Department, not necessarily USAID because that's gone now, but the State Department, the Defense Department needs to look at that vacuum and say, okay, what is going to fill that? And perhaps work with the local governments or encourage the local governments in finding a solution. And the solution might be some form of aid that comes across in a different structure, maybe with different constraints. That's not as lulled to sleep as USAID bureaucracy has become, which is why they got the axe. And so I think we might be able to agree there that the vacuum needs to be looked at. And certainly if it creates an additional crisis, we want to intervene. But maybe we intervene corporately with other countries, with other similar countries. You know, NATO might intervene in some countries that are tied to Europe. You know, African Union intervenes along with U.S. help and guidance and perhaps money. And maybe the money is investment money, who knows? But there might be some solutions that will be discovered now because we are innovative. They're discovered now that we see the vacuums, because now we'll start to see the vacuum. So I think we might be aligned somewhat there.
I think we are. And go ahead, Dr. Manko.
I thought you had something to say.
I do. And I was going to comment, I do think we are quite possibly much more aligned than at first we may have believed. I have a couple of thoughts on this. I think any time that a local solution can be found that is, and I'm going to use this word, organically growing, if you will, in the community, that's far preferable to at least the members of that community as a solution in my mind, right? I think conditions to that would be if there is a better solution that maybe they couldn't afford, right? Then that's a great place possibly for aid to be strategically used, right? But here, like in Seattle, I always remember that we don't want to, just give a hand out. We want to give a hand up in our local communities, right? So that's a phrase we used in the nonprofits around here. We'll give you a hand up, not a hand out. And in the same way, I think if we can align with working programs that have outcomes, not just good deeds. A good deed is a good deed, and that's great, but it's not an outcome. What we want is an impact, right? We want good outcomes, not just good deeds. So when I look at this, I think, can we do this? And Rob, you mentioned there are situations where this vacuum is being filled by violence or by authoritarianism, terrorism. It's a national security instance in my mind. That's what national security does. They step in and they look at protecting American citizens, protecting lives of innocent civilians, whatever, protecting that strategic position that we need to have as a nation. Short of that, though, I think there is a good way that we can scale the aid that we give, attach it to programs that motivate local leaders to build indigenous solutions to the problems, provide targeted aid where we can, where something might be unforeseen or difficult to get a hold of. In doing so, really have an influence that allows us to keep an American perspective while not overriding the perspective of the communities that we're trying to serve.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
gentlemen, for that thoughtful debate, and we can see. But first of all, I think there is an audit that needs to be done at the USAID level, so that all the corruption can be rooted out, and then they can rethink and then re-strategize the entire program. So that's what I can say on my side. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this show. I'm sure you enjoyed it. You've heard views from both sides. And the idea is not to completely cut the entire things, because there are instances when the aid is needed. And once the crisis goes away, then I think there needs to be rethinking of programs that needs to be funded. There are many other programs that can be rechanneled, where the funds can be rechanneled to support developmental programs around the African continent. So on my right, that is Rob Smith, and on my left is Dr. David Scratchley. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Next
Dave.
time. Thank
Thank you,
you.
Minko.